So let me ask Dr. Bernstein a question. Doc, why did you think inflation was temporary?
The word, of course, transitory is what you're referring to, and I not only believe, but I've said, and this is...
Well, is temporary and transitory, those are synonymous, right?
Yeah, those are they're synonyms. And
okay,
I think
well, tell me why...
But I think transitory was...
Tell me why you thought inflation... I'm going to be accurate. Why in your infinite wisdom you thought inflation was transitory or temporary?
Well, let me be clear about what we meant at the time. And by the way, and this is contrary to what Ranking Member Scott said earlier, I did not ever say that people didn't understand transitory. What I said was we didn't understand transitory. In fact...
Well, that's clear. We can stipulate to that.
That word is temporally ambiguous. It meant different things. To some people it meant 2 weeks, to some people it meant 2 years. What we meant, and let me answer your question, we thought inflation was going to accelerate and gradually cool down over time. Now that has turned out to be in fact, the pattern that inflation has taken. But transitory was much too ambiguous a description of that dynamic. Acceleration, cooling.
So now inflation is down from 9% to 5%. Are you telling me that when you said inflation was transitory, you were correct?
No, I'm not saying I was correct or incorrect. What I'm saying was that was an ambiguous...
Like you're saying you were correct.
No, I'm saying that was an ambiguous, an unclear word that was poorly chosen, I think, for that discussion because it meant different things to different people. To me...
Well, has it been transitory?
Inflation has, in fact, behaved much as I just described. We thought inflation was going to accelerate and gradually cool over time. And that is
Chair's going to cut me off. Has it been transitory?
Inflation has accelerated and cooled.
Senator's time's expired. I want to fulfill what you said, that I was going to cut you off. Senator Brett from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying it was wonderful to see Senator Fetterman here today. As a friend and a freshman colleague, it's great to have him back both in this committee room and here in the Capitol. Thank you for appearing before this committee today. We appreciate your time and your intentionality in answering our questions. I believe that this committee's role is that of oversight, and it's essential for holding leaders in our executive departments accountable for the decisions they make and policies they promote that affect all Americans, whether it be in our housing programs or our macroeconomic policies. America has seen inflation increase by 15.4% since President Biden came into office. As a mom of 2 school-aged kids, I see this firsthand every time I go to the grocery store or to the gas pump. Groceries are up 20% and energy costs are up 36%. Families in Alabama, South Carolina, Ohio, and in every community across the country are feeling that pain. Rising prices have cost that typical households, it's about $10,000 in 2 years. Families, parents, and retirees have had to bear the brunt of that persistent inflation over these last 23, 24 months. Dr. Bernstein, I wanted to talk to you following up on what Senator Kennedy was asking you. I know you've been asked once, but I want to make sure that we can clarify this. Do you still stand by your past comments indicating that inflation is transitory?
The problem with the word transitory is that it's become, I think, an unhelpful and much too ambiguous term to describe the trajectory of inflation. It is true that that word or any other word, temporary, any synonym, suggests a condition where inflation accelerates and then inflation decelerates. It slows down. Now, inflation peaked at 9% in June, and most recently was seen at 5%. That's its lowest annual growth rate since November of 2021. So in that sense, the view of acceleration then deceleration was correct. Transitory, however, was too temporally ambiguous a term.
Okay, so you do agree that that term should not have been used?
I think that the term was far too ambiguous to give people a clear sense of what we were thinking.
Yeah, and so one of the things we need you to do as a leader and someone who advises is give the public very clear indications of what we can expect. Unfortunately, the word transitory for many means temporary. It means that it would be short-lived. That's certainly not what we've seen. We've seen inflation above 5% every single month for 23 straight months, and real wages have gone down for 2 straight years. One of the things that Chairman Brown said about you and that was indicated in the letter is that you are open to changing your mind. So once again, just want to directly ask that word transitory should have never been used.
I don't want to say it should never have been used. I think that the word is not a helpful term. I think it's too ambiguous. I think it doesn't clearly, it does not clearly delineate either what we believe to be the case or the actual trajectory. Now, that said, it is true that we saw inflation accelerate and we've seen inflation cool, but we have a lot more to go.
Would you agree that it's lasted longer than you anticipated when you first used that term?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bernstein, you've also championed massive spending packages pushed by President Biden over these last 2 years, the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. You publicly said that they would decrease inflation. The hard truth is that these bills and policies have increased inflation, and the result in some saying that we may be having to have a recession in order to stem inflation. More spending is not the answer. To lower costs for all Americans, we have to stop the reckless spending, reduce regulatory burdens on job creators, and unleash American energy production so that we are not just energy independent, but energy dominant. President Biden has nominated you for the position of the chair of Council of Economic Advisors, of which you currently serve as a member of the council. 72% of Americans believe that the economy is headed in the wrong direction. And as one of the architects of the past 2 years of the failing economic policies of this administration, it is concerning to me that President Biden is asking the Senate to confirm you to this position. Last month, we saw President Biden propose his budget for fiscal year 2024 that includes a $6.9 trillion tax and spending spree that we know will continue to drive inflation even higher. All we have to do is look over the past 2 years for the evidence of that. I would ask you, how can the American people expect different results when this administration and its economic advisors tend to look like they're doubling down on what I believe has not worked?
So thank you for the question, Senator. I respectfully would like to challenge some of the ways you've teed up some issues there. So first of all, the rescue plan was actually fiscally smaller than the CARES Act. So if that was massive, then the CARES Act was even more massive. The Inflation Reduction Act more than pays for itself. It actually reduces the budget deficit by over $200 billion over 10 years. In terms of the budget, the president's budget, once again, that not only pays for the proposals in the budget, but reduces the deficit by almost $3 trillion over 10 years. So I think that those characterizations go in a different direction than some that you were suggesting, respectfully.
And respectfully, I would disagree. I think if we were producing more energy, if we were to be spending less money, I think inflation would not have been as quote-unquote transitory as you first put forth.
So if I may, Senator, the production of crude oil under President Biden is the highest.
I heard you say that earlier.
Is the highest under any president on record. In fact, under President Biden, on average, the production is 560,000 barrels per day, greater than under the previous administration.
And we see what's happening in Europe and the UK, and you've referenced that earlier. And if we were doing more to help them with their energy needs, I think that we would see those costs go down as well.
Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bernstein, I'd like to start with you and talk about what I see as a very troubling trend that's been developing. It's been strengthening over the past several years. And that's the growing momentum and efforts of our allies and our adversaries to weaken the dollar's role as the international reserve currency. That includes Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin. I've got an article right here that I was just reading. Brazil's Lula calls for an end to dollar trade dominance. China applauds this. Even Malaysia sought to promote alternatives to the dollar. All of this, the CCP is applauding. And my first question to you is, do you agree that China wants to see this happen?
I think there's some evidence that it does.
It seems to be a great deal of evidence that it does. I think specifically, and we could talk about this from a strategic standpoint, why would China want to see this happen?
I think there are extremely important privileges and even in the realm of security, reasons to have the benefits from having the reserve currency. One of the most obvious is, of course, sanctions. If you control the reserve currency, you're able to impose sanctions, as we've done on Russia, to considerable effect. But there are other positive aspects as well.
I do see the positive aspects, and that's why I want to get into this next question, which has to do with some of your writings. And you've written a number of op-eds pushing for the U.S. to willingly cede the dollar's dominance arguing that we should, and I'm going to use some quotes, be happy to shed this privilege, and that we should, quote, dethrone King Dollar. And so I'm trying to understand if you seem to believe that China would be better off if this were to happen. I'm trying to understand where you are on this point right now. Do you think that the United States would actually be better off if the dollar were to somehow lose its status as the world?
Definitely not, Senator, but I certainly understand the references you're making, and I apologize if there's confusion there. What I was trying...
I'm not confused. I'm just trying to understand what...
Well, I think you're actually not quite capturing what I was trying to get at there, so let me try to explain
Please
it to you.
explain.
Yeah. The benefits of having the reserve currency are, as we've discussed, and we could go on to elaborate those benefits. There are costs as well, particularly when other countries with whom we compete, China back in the 80s and 90s to some extent, but other countries as well, manage their currencies in order to have a trade advantage against us. Now, from this very dais recently, Senator Vance asked this question of Chair Powell, to the extent to which reserve currency status can strengthen the dollar and disadvantage our manufacturers. What I was trying to do in those writings was to explore both sides of the issues, the very solid benefits that I think you and I agree on, but also the costs, which I think we too often ignore, particularly to our manufacturers.
I understand the issue of the cost, but in terms of the strength of the benefits and the strategic value, I certainly know where I stand. I'd like to know where you stand in terms of the weight of this. Where would you stand on balance, and where will the Biden administration be?
So I share your view on the importance of the dollar as the dominant reserve currency.
Perfect, because I think that's an incredibly important tool, particularly as we look at what China is threatening to do with respect to Taiwan. We look at the incredible debt that we piled up and the cost of interest that is, the interest rate cost, which at CBO is projected to actually be greater than our entire defense budget.
Senator, if I may make one point, because we are in agreement here, one thing we could really do to help both the dollar maintain its reserve currency status, but also to protect the value of the dollar would be to raise the debt ceiling. I think having that kind of default out there as a political tool is antithetical to what you and I are talking about right now.
I think you just need to finish the sentence. We need to raise the debt ceiling at the same time that we begin to get our fiscal house in order.
Agreed.
Because the fiscal spending is, I think, going to let the market dictate what happens to the dollar as a reserve currency. And if we continue to allow deficit spending to go out of control, I very, very seriously am concerned that we do it to ourselves. I know China would like to do it to us. China would like to see us lose our status as a reserve currency, but I think the biggest threat is from within by allowing our spending to get out of control. That's the path that we're on now, and we need to see it back under control. Thank you, Mr.